Now, a host of African leaders have arrived in Beijing for a summit that could further strengthen China's influence across the African continent. President Xi Jinping is expected to urge African nations to take more Chinese goods in exchange for pledges of new Chinese investment and loans. But many of the African partners he's courting want more favourable financial terms as debt pressures mount on them.
China has invested billions to access Africa's wealth of oil, copper, cobalt and other resources, building roads, railways and port facilities. The project ensures the swift and efficient transfer of raw materials to China, while the countries in question obtain infrastructure that benefits their economic development. But the boom is now over.
Many African countries have gotten into debt trouble. And they realize they have to cut back on the amount of loans they're taking out because they will have trouble repaying them. As a result, the whole Belt and Road Initiative has slowed down in Africa.
But China's presence on the continent still far outstrips that of Europe. At the turn of the millennium, the trade relations of many African countries were still dominated by Europe. Almost 2 decades later, the situation had been completely transformed. That economic dominance is part of China's strategy to become the world's preeminent superpower. While many Western firms are put off by the high risks involved, Chinese companies enjoy state backing.
One of the problems that the West faces is that private foreign direct investment depends overwhelmingly on the private sectors of Europe and the United States, whereas China has a stronger ability to manipulate the amount of foreign direct investment that goes in. The government plays a larger role.
In addition to traditional infrastructure, the state-affiliated technology giant Huawei is also involved, expanding Africa's telecoms networks. Chinese companies are also cracking the consumer market, with low-price phones as well as clothing and cars. That said, Europe has launched an initiative to make up lost ground. And Middle Eastern countries are also fast-growing investors in the African continent.
Now, China has lent African countries about 170 billion euros since the year 2000. That has left many countries saddled with debt that they're now struggling to pay back. Kenya, for example, has had to increase taxes to help pay its debts. That's a move that's resulted in violent protests. So what is it that Kenyans want their president to achieve in China? DW's East Africa Bureau Chief Mariel Müller put that question to young people in Nairobi.
Ruto is there to negotiate for himself, not for Kenyans. He is going to borrow, bring money for development, but accountability now is the problem we're facing. The money will just disappear in those people surrounding President Ruto. Corrupt. These people are so corrupt.
We should finish paying what we owe them first before getting the next loan. Even though the money would help us, we should first pay back what we have borrowed before asking for more.
Many Kenyans are painfully aware of the downsides of seemingly attractive infrastructure projects financed by China, like the $5 billion railway that was supposed to transform Kenya into an industrialized middle-income country, connecting it with its neighbor Uganda. But the track stopped short of the border because of unpaid debts. The project became infamous as the prime example of the pitfalls of borrowing, corruption, and mismanagement.
The railway is just one example of large-scale infrastructure projects financed by China that critics say were neither financially viable nor to the benefit of most Kenyans. This elevated highway connecting Nairobi with its international airport has also been criticized. The taxpayer was burdened with the costs, but only few Kenyans can afford the ride.
Citizens would have preferred to see the money invested in healthcare or education. China is Kenya's biggest lender by country. It owes Beijing $7 billion, mainly for the development of roads, rails, and port infrastructure. Experts say the continent is hooked on China's easy money.
Africa now is in a comfort zone, and Kenya, of course. So we know that even if we go broke, we can get some money. So there's that cycle. China also now, when we go and get money from them, then they do not really ask so many questions. Not like the IMF, they don't tell us, you have to tax people. Them, they don't really interfere with the internal affairs of the country.
To pay off its debt to the IMF, Kenya's President William Ruto proposed tax increases. But they were widely unpopular and led to months-long and deadly protests across the country. He was forced to abandon the tax hikes and is now again eyeing less complicated loans from China. Struggling under a cost of living crisis and unemployment, young Kenyans say they've had enough of China-financed prestige projects that leave them and future generations in debt. Instead, they want more jobs.
They should be able to incorporate the Kenyan youth. They should be able to give them an opportunity so that they can also benefit from this. I'm very disappointed. I feel that our government is not listening to us. My needs are not being taken care of. And so I expect financial prudence as it goes ahead to quote-unquote negotiate deals on behalf of the government that I don't get to see the benefit, I only get to see the repercussion, which I feel as a tax-paying Kenyan.
Kenya's total debt is equivalent to 2/3 of its GDP. Interest payments alone are eating up more than a quarter of the revenue it collects. That and the economic crisis Kenya is in don't leave William Ruto much choice in negotiations with China, other than to ask for even more loans, observers say. But China could do more to help African countries to escape the debt cycle.
They can come and put industries here that even if we don't have the finance to do the finished product, but it can add value so that we don't just ship out raw materials, then we can have more jobs for Africans, and so we don't have to keep begging and trying to emigrate to other countries that are more developed.
China's focus for this summit has now shifted from financing big infrastructure to green technology and energy. Kenyans hope this time it will benefit them more.
And for more, I'm joined now by our East Africa Bureau Chief, Mariel Müller, who filed that report for us. Mariel, China has sought to tap Africa's vast troves of natural resources. We're talking about copper, gold, lithium, rare earth minerals. Is its focus mainly the economy?
Yeah, so some of the minerals you mentioned are needed and crucial in order to create renewable technology and to, for example, manufacture batteries. So China, the US and Europe are in this global race for green energy. And this forum that's happening now in Beijing is part of that race. So China, by offering loans and investments to African countries, is also trying to expand its mining presence on the continent. And by doing so, it has also learned its lessons from the past. So it's not handing out these or offering huge amounts of money for mega infrastructure projects anymore. It's more looking into smaller projects, more green technology. And it has, as I said, learned this lesson because it has seen some African nations, many actually, are not able to repay loans. And that is, for example, what's happening with Angola. They have tried to restructure its debt with China, but has failed to do so. Angola is also not part of this forum now. So yeah, China has basically now its focus on green energy, for example, hydro power stations or solar energy.
And what about the African countries? What are they, who are attending this forum, what are they expecting to get from it?
Yeah, so there's one big interest not to inflate their debt even more. And then there's, on the other hand, they need financing of infrastructure projects that they've already started with Chinese money, for example. So we see Kenya, for example, the President, William Ruto, is also trying to get money for unfinished roads, highways, the international airport here in Nairobi, and also the standard gauge railway we saw in the report that's also unfinished. Then we've seen actually an agreement signed during this forum already between Tanzania, Zambia, with China, also to finish a decades-old railway that is supposed to connect Zambia's cobalt mines with the Tanzanian coast. And then we've seen, for example, the president of Nigeria meeting with Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping basically saying he will encourage powerful Chinese companies to invest more in Nigeria and more in the energy sector, also in mining, So that's basically the line that most African nations are following. One notable thing was a meeting between Zimbabwean President Mnangagwa and Xi Jinping, in which Xi Jinping said he's supporting the struggle of Zimbabwe against illegal, quote, sanctions imposed by the US. The US has imposed these sanctions because of corruption and human rights abuses, but you can get a sense of what China is trying to do. They're trying to fill space that, for example, the US has left open.
Well, let's talk about the power balance here. I mean, to what extent are these African heads of state beholden to Xi, who is, of course, holding the purse strings here?
Yes, so many African nations are facing a lot of pressure from home. They are facing either economic crises, surging debt, as mentioned, also high cost of living. And so people were on the streets here in Kenya, in Uganda, in Nigeria, protesting these conditions. And so they have a lot of pressure to come back with good deals to present. And that's basically what African nations are trying to do. So if they have the choice between IMF loans that are normally they have strings attached. They have conditions, sometimes harsh conditions, including tax increases, for example. Or they can choose Chinese loans, which don't have these conditions. Also, China doesn't ask for human rights, doesn't care about human rights abuses. They're also not asking about democracy. So that's basically the choice that African nations have. And looking at what happened in Kenya, for example, when President Ruto tried to increase taxes to also to repay loans to the IMF, that's not a good example. And so that's why many African nations are actually going for the Chinese option here.
Mm-hmm. Just one last question. Africa, of course, is also geopolitically important for China, isn't it? I mean, Beijing wants to expand its zones of influence, as you've been saying. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background to that?
Yeah, that's true. So China tries to expand its influence geopolitically, and that's if they give out loans and investments and deepen their economic ties with African nations, they of course expect something in return. So, for example, when it comes to UN votes in the General Assembly regarding Taiwan, or also domestic issues in China when it comes to human rights abuses, China of course expects loyalty from African nations here. And that's also what African leaders are painfully aware of. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, for example, said ahead of the summit that he's not gonna come for, he's not gonna extend the begging bowl to China. So this power imbalance is definitely something that everyone is aware of.
Mariel Müller in Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Mariel, thank you so much for that. And we can get more now from journalist Fabian Kretschmer, who joins us from Beijing. Fabian, tell us, first of all, how the Chinese government is framing these talks.
Yeah, China definitely wants to present itself as a diplomatic power that is very active on the world stage and that is, supporting the global South. I think that's one message that the Chinese government wants to convey. And it also wants to represent an alternative, world order, different from the West. China is always emphasizing that, look, we don't have a colonial past. We are not morally giving you any lessons. We don't ask any critical questions. We don't care about your political system. We're here for pragmatic cooperation, win-win. And I mean, that's, of course, the messaging level and the reality. It looks much more complex, but I think really that's the message that China wants to send out. Look, we have developed our economy, and if you cooperate with us, you can do too. And that's what they want to send to the African countries who are here in Beijing.
So China's saying, basically, go with us because it's easier. But if we look at the practicalities, China's given massive loans to build ports, mega projects across Africa. Paying back those loans is clearly now proving difficult. So how is China planning on working with its African trading partners now?
Yeah, there has been clearly a paradigm shift. So the problem that has been reported heavily on is the debt trap, that African countries feel that they depend too much on China, that they cannot pay back the debts that they have. But I think from the other side, vice versa, it's also quite problematic. I mean, Chinese taxpayers are also not happy how carelessly in the past their money has been spent. And basically, many of those big infrastructure projects were not successful. Until 2017, really, China has been lending massively. And I think that came out of a political desire, but then that clashed with economic reality. And now the spending is much less. I mean, it has decreased massively since 2018-19, and only now it has returned a little bit. But the new paradigm, what the Chinese government is saying, it's called Xiao which means small but beautiful, and this should indicate that now we look more careful on which projects we finance. They are more smaller on a scale, but in terms of quality, they are higher.
Okay, quality, not quantity. So in that new framework, what products in particular does China want African nations to buy?
Well, I mean, Chinese consumer electronics definitely is gaining a lot of ground in African markets, and also textile products are popular. But I really want to, I think it's important to look at the scale. So the whole Africa-China trade volume is comparable with the trade volume of China and Russia, or China and Germany. So it is not, at least if you compare on a country-to-country level, not so important yet. But for example, what is really strategically important for China is that Africa can provide or can help to secure China's food security, and that China does not depend anymore on the West for doing so, or it can get rare minerals from Congo, for example. And in that regard, China definitely has a strategic role that it plays in the eyes of Beijing.
And Fabian, is this just an economic relationship, or is China also hoping for more military ties with African countries?
Well, there are many security cooperations that China has with many, many African countries, and it's also no coincidence that the only or the first military base outside of China of the People's Liberation Army is in Africa. So there's the military aspect. But I think the really main point of also this forum that we have here in Beijing is global influence. So China wants to have a network of friendly nations. For example, when it comes to votes in front of the United Nations, then it wants as many countries as possible to back up China's positions. For example, with Taiwan, with human rights, etc. And I think that is really one battleground that China is rivaling, competing with the European Union and also with the US, and who has more influence in Africa and in general in the global South.
Fabian Kretschmer reporting from Beijing. Fabian, thank you so much.